Peace, all peace. So recently, I've been seeing a lot of banter, a lot of chat, a lot of disputes all over the internet, social media, YouTube, and things of that nature regarding the much disputed topic of predictive programming. And I just wanted to break it down from my perspective and how I see things. So basically, predictive programming entails the simulation of events that occur in real life before they actually happen. This can be in video games, books, music, and of course TV shows and movies, which is mainly what I'll be breaking down throughout this video. And since there will be a couple examples throughout the video, this will most likely be the first entry in a series where I'll break things down in more detail with future entries. Many say art imitates life, but I think we have to start asking the question, does life imitate art? As we know, we've been through a lot these past couple of years with CV19, and the amount of examples that predictive programming has presented in combination with what has occurred in real life events and situations cannot be mere happenstance or a mere coincidence, but rather more like an orchestrated world event that was planned in advance, hence the word predictive. So I'll get right into it. So the first example that immediately comes to mind as far as predictive programming in media that have shown themselves to be true in real life situations, in real life events, is the 2007 classic I Am Legend starring Will Smith. In particular, there was a scene near the beginning of the film where the city, along with Will Smith, his wife, and his daughter were getting evacuated, and his wife was unable to get by because she scanned as infected. Will Smith snapped and told the soldiers, scan her again, scan her again, scan her again. And they did. And then she was able to get by. That sounds a lot like real life situations where, quite honestly, there could have been people that were mistaken as positive for CV19, when in reality, they were perfectly healthy, perfectly fine, and most likely were mistakenly scanned or mistakenly tested and told otherwise, just like in the film. Next, that brings me to the 2011 film Captain America: First Avenger, starring Chris Evans. There was a very, very telling scene with Chris Evans and Samuel L. Jackson set in Times Square. In the background of Captain America, Chris Evans' character, obviously, you can see a bunch of billboards in Times Square. Among those billboards, you can see a Corona beer, a Corona. You can see the iconography or the symbol for a virus. On the right, you can also see the quote, "Fear is the mind killer," which was written by a man named Frank Herbert. And also, if you look up Frank Herbert, once upon a time, he wrote a book called Dune. Dune was re-released as a movie in 2021, and the art for the movie was an eclipse. Among those billboards behind Chris Evans, you can also see a billboard of an eclipse. And we know that the outermost layer of an eclipse is called a corona. Lastly, you can see the billboard for a mask, kind of like a Jabberwocky looking mask. So when you put all those factors together, all those different billboards, all those signs and symbols, there's essentially no way that this can be considered a coincidence. Especially when you consider that New York City, which is where Times Square is obviously, was the city in the United States most affected when it came to CV19. Now, speaking of masks, that brings me to my next example, which is from the TV show Project Runway. Now, in 2019, there was a participant on the show from India named Kovid Kapoor. Keep in mind, CV19 and the pandemic wasn't until 2020. But in 2019, that participant and designer, Kovid Kapoor, had a design which revolved around a mask. Now, typically, this is for models, this is for fashion. It would be maybe a shirt, a dress, pants, things of that nature. But a mask, largely unusual. Definitely predictive programming, if you ask me. And for the cherry on top, just like Captain America First Avenger being set in Times Square in New York, the designer on Project Runway, Kovid Kapoor, their hometown is also in New York, which again was the city most affected in the United States by CV-19. This example is arguably the most important example throughout the video. Utopia is a TV series that was released through the Amazon Prime streaming service, and in fairness to when it was released, as far as predictive programming, it was released in September 2020. So that was after the pandemic started. So I'll give it that. But if you're intelligent, you would ask the question, why would they release that in the middle of the pandemic? That seems in poor taste. Which is most likely why soon after, in November 2020, the series was canceled. Nonetheless, Utopia is about a group of comic book fans that throughout the show are able to put the pieces together and discover a global conspiracy in a comic book that has clues about future events that would soon play out in the show. Among those clues include a plan that convinces the world's population of a deadly new virus, and that once the world's population is convinced, announcing to the public the creation of a new jab or new shot. And in the show, through the elites, through the government, through organizations and corporations, they quickly move together to inject the world's population with this jab or with this shot. And I kid you not, it was only one season, but by the end of the show, it turns out that the jab or the shot was actually designed to sterilize all the people that took it, causing the global population to drop from 7.8 billion, which is what we're at right now, to about 500 million, which is very, very interesting and very telling, and I'll explain why. Now, mind you, Utopia was released in September of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic and before the jab or the shot was even available in real life, which really makes you think, why would they put something like this in a TV show? One, and two, don't you think that's in poor taste? Don't you think that lacks a bit of class and just empathy for what everybody was going through at that particular time? In Utopia, like I mentioned earlier, the jab or the shot was administered to the global population with the goal in mind, once again, to sterilize the population and reduce the global population down to 500 million. Once again, that figure is very specific and very interesting because earlier this month, July 6th, 2022, if you look this up, you can see that the Georgia Guidestones were blown up and went down. And on those Georgia Guidestones, there were a set of rules, and the first rule was maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. So when you put two and two together, if you can put patterns together and draw connections, I mean, it clearly speaks for itself. Now, on to the next example is the 2010 TED Talk from the famous billionaire Bill Gates, which was actually titled Innovating to Zero. Now, through his TED Talk speech, which again was from 2010, Bill Gates discussed how climate change was a major issue that the global population was experiencing, and that in order to attack this, we had to reduce our carbon emissions, CO2. And in order to do that, there was an equation which included people, services per person, energy per service, and CO2 per energy. And he said that in order to innovate to zero, we had to make sure that one or all of those factors had to be brought down to zero as closely as possible. Of course, that included people and the population. And he mentioned that if we, I don't know who we is, did a very good job with vaccines and healthcare and reproductive health services, that we could reduce that figure by about 10 or 15%. Again, if you can draw patterns and make conclusions and put two and two together, it's rather self-explanatory. Bill Gates brings me to my last movie example, which is the 2016 film Inferno, starring Tom Hanks. Now, you may ask yourself, how does Bill Gates and Inferno relate? For starters, Inferno's plot was about a billionaire that was bent on solving the world's overpopulation issue, much like Bill Gates' 2010 TED Talk 6 years prior. And for the cherry on top, I kid you not, Inferno was released the same day as Bill Gates' birthday, October 28th. If you don't believe me, you can look this up. No lie. Lastly, the movie also starred Tom Hanks, like I mentioned before, and Tom Hanks, if you can remember, was actually the first celebrity to catch CV-19 in real life back in March 2020. Way too many coincidences balled together in this example. That about wraps it up for my breakdown of the numerous amount of movies and TV shows that have displayed predictive programming that coincides with what's been going on in real life as of late, these past few years. But I really want you guys, the audience, to also go look up CladeX and also Event201, which were two notable pandemic simulations that were ran before CV was officially a global pandemic in 2020. The CladeX simulation was ran on May 15th, 2018, and the Event201 simulation was ran on October 18th, 2019, both far before the pandemic was declared, which, despite them not being TV shows or movies or pieces of media in that regard, are the ultimate example of predictive programming, especially when considering that these were real-life events and real-life examples. Event201 was based on CV in itself and featured prominent corporations like the UN, Johns Hopkins, the CDC, Johnson & Johnson, and of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So make sure you guys check that out. Stay safe and see you soon. Bless!